Welcome to the European Forum Outback. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska and you're watching TVP World. And on this beautiful morning here in Austria, I am joined by Misha Glenny, my next guest, the rector of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, a broadcaster, a journalist, and the best-selling author of McMafia, which we're going to talk about more today. So thank you for joining me.
You're welcome.
So I think most of our viewers will know you by your book McMafia that I just mentioned, which looked at the elaborate network of transnational crime. 17 years on since that book was published, what would you say the network looks like? Who would be the key players?
I would say the network is bigger, it's more powerful, and the key issue, I think, in its growth over the past 17 years has been its use and deployment of technology. This has made organized crime much more efficient than it was before. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at narcotics, whether you're looking at people smuggling, whether you're looking at the trade, the illegal trade in wild animals, for example. All of it is bigger and much more efficient than it was before. The key players always depend on what you're looking at. Are you looking at the illegal mining of gold, for example? In that case, you have to look at the Amazon and see these extraordinarily large organized crime groups like the PCC in Brazil, which is involved in drugs, it's involved in illegal mining, and it's involved in extortion and political corruption. So it depends what you're looking at, but wherever you look, there is an organized crime network which is very efficient and generally collaborating with other organized crime networks.
And what about Europe?
Well, Europe is primarily a consumer zone of organized crime. You have producer zones, you have distribution zones. The Balkans famously is a distribution zone where illegal goods and services from all over the world are channeled into the European Union, and then you have the consumer zones. What you have seen, particularly in the narcotics trade, is a shift of production away from the traditional areas like Colombia or Afghanistan into countries like the Netherlands or the United Kingdom, where they are producing synthetic drugs. So the rise of synthetic drugs has transformed that market completely. China is involved in it, Mexico is involved in it, but in Holland, for example, the south of Holland, this has become a very, very rich zone for organized criminal activity where they produce drugs, they don't only sell and distribute them.
So you mentioned these threats. You mentioned the use of technology, which is something new that has changed over those 17 years. What are the ways to counter it? What could possibly the governments do in order to be able to put that under control?
Well, it's a sword and shield game, as they say. You know, you put up some defenses and the attacker finds a way around those defenses. So there is a great example at the moment in terms of technology of something called EncroChat. EncroChat was an encrypted communications network over mobile phones that had been partially set up and partially infiltrated by European police forces. And they sat there and watched all the criminal activity, the organization of criminal activities going on. And then after about 2 or 3 years where they had mapped all the groups using EncroChat, they then swooped in on them and arrested literally hundreds of people, in some of the toughest criminals in Europe. So there are ways of dealing with it, but it's extremely difficult because the scale of things has expanded and resources for police forces have not been increased on the whole.
Would you say that such activities could be supported by countries such as Russia and potentially used as element of hybrid warfare against other countries to put more strain on them?
It's an important point that in some areas of the world, organized crime relies on collaboration with political instances, with political structures. And Russia had a very peculiar development during the 1990s and afterwards, whereby oligarchs were supported by organized criminal groups and indeed pretty much controlled the state when Yeltsin was around. What Putin did was to flip that around, whereby the state collaborated with oligarchs and organized crime, but controlled them. And when it comes to technology, cybercrime, so the biggest expansion of all at the moment is in cybercriminal activity. And there's no question that the Russian state allows cybercriminal activity that is directed towards Europe and the United States in particular. They are covered completely. They don't get arrested. They're indeed encouraged to engage in this type of activity as a way of undermining morale in the West.
In the existing circumstance right now, we see countries like Moldova and Ukraine, that is at war with Russia currently, trying to make a step towards EU accession process. And there is a set list of rules that have to be fulfilled for these countries to be able to actually join the European Union. How would you say that places such as Moldova and Ukraine are dealing with, let's say, mafia activity, corruption, to be able to take that extra step closer to the European Union?
Well, it's very difficult. I'd point out that in 2004, when we had the big expansion of the European Union, those political criteria were a rough guideline rather than a precise demand.
They're way more specific now.
They are more specific, but what 2004 demonstrates is that if the European Union makes a political decision to enlarge, it can do so and will do so if that consensus is there in the EU. Frankly, the problem with Ukraine and Moldova is partially related to what goes on in the Western Balkans. The Western Balkans, the countries from the Balkans which haven't yet acceded to the EU, they've been sitting there waiting for over 20 years, and they're fed up with waiting. And so it would be politically very difficult from that perspective to bring in Moldova and Ukraine. But in terms of corruption, both obviously have a lot to do. And unfortunately, events that we saw 3 weeks ago, last month that was, when Zelensky decided to disband the anti-corruption
something he had to walk
office,
back on.
Something he had to walk back on. That was very damaging to Ukraine's credibility because it demonstrated that old habits die hard in places like Ukraine. So there is a lot of work to do, and Moldova, as we know, is under considerable political and hybrid attack from Russia. Its resources are very slim, and it's been working very hard. The government in Moldova. We're about to see things might be about to change in Moldova, so we'll wait on that one. But they have been working hard.
We've heard from Vjosa Osmani, who's the president of the Republic of Kosovo, accusations launched at Alexander Vučić, Serbian president, of sponsoring mafia to wreak havoc in Kosovo. What do we know about these allegations? Because you mentioned the Balkans, you mentioned the sort of turmoil that is taking place there.
Well, the Serbian situation is probably the most important set of events going on in the Balkans at the moment. In fact, without question, I would say. Vučić has had a huge amount under his control for the past 10 to 15 years or so, and it's more or less under his personal control. So things in Serbia tend not to happen without Vučić, at the very least, knowing about it, if not approving about it. But he is under a tremendous attack from a large part of Serbian society at the moment, and so his situation has become considerably less stable in the past year or so. There is an ongoing uprising in Serbia, and I think this potentially threatens Vučić's power structures. But there's no question he knows about a lot of the mafia activity going on in Serbia. But there is also mafia activity going on in Kosovo. Let's not fool ourselves. The point about the leadership in Kosovo is that Osmani and Albin Kurti, who was, of course, leading the government for several years, are personally not corrupt. But that doesn't mean that there isn't corruption and mafia activity going on in Kosovo. You see it in Montenegro as well. You see it in North Macedonia. You see it in
most
Bosnia.
places across the globe.
Indeed. But the Balkans, because of what happened during the 1990s in particular, the very troubled transition and violent transition from communism to the free market, has a particularly important central role in organized criminal activity. The Albanian mafia, we know, has expanded now very successfully into Ecuador, for example, in South America, and is heavily involved in the destabilization of Ecuador because of the lucrative nature of the cocaine trade. It's constantly shifting and changing, but there's no question that the Balkans has a big struggle with organized crime.
What about the l'enfant terrible of Europe, as it's been previously called? What about Hungary and Viktor Orban in relation to corruption and mafia? We know that there's also a network of his family members who are in the positions of power in Hungary. What do we know about that in that very context?
And certain famous, well-known economists and authors have referred to Hungary as a mafia state. This is a very personal form of autocracy that we see in Hungary, which has been a very successful model as autocrat goes in terms of sustaining some measure of popular support. But let's not forget what Orban has also done is he has throttled independent media, he has throttled the independent network of courts, the independence of courts. This is absolutely critical for autocrats. They cannot rely on their popularity alone, and so they have to intervene in the media. They have to intervene in the non-governmental sector. They have to intervene in the courts so that they can create this structure of personalized corruption. And Orban is one of the great authors of the autocrat's playbook. And we see that playing out in the United States now with what is happening in Chicago, in Washington, what's been threatened to happen in Chicago and possibly even New York as well, the gerrymandering and so on. However, Orban has not gone the full hog, and he is genuinely under threat in the elections of next year. He's trailing in the polls to Peter Magyar, and it's anyone's guess whether he's still going to be in power in a year's time. And of course, for the European,
it's an interesting space to watch over the next few months.
It is very, very important, this election, of whether Orban can hold on to power, and of course his family network and all the oligarchic structures around him.
And us as TVP World, we are covering the situation in Hungary, so we will be keeping a close watch. Thank you so very much for joining me. Misha Glenny, Rector at the Institute for Human Sciences, Vienna, was my guest. Pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And so this would be all for now, but please do stay tuned. Stay with us here on TVP World for more.